of the organ of corti. So we know that the motor neurons are the final common pathway, and on this pathway there is input from the same segment of the spinal cord, that is afferent input or sensory input. Okay. So this sensory input is must to decide the course of action by the motor neurons. And in the anterior gray horn itself, we can make out two motor neurons, the alpha and gamma motor neuron. Alpha motor neuron is concerned with the muscle contraction or ability to move the joints is because of the activity of the alpha motor neuron. While the gamma motor neuron is motor to the muscle spindle of the skeletal muscle itself. Got it? So in due course we'll learn about all these alpha and gamma motor neuron. Yes. So both of these lower motor neurons, that is the neurons lying in brainstem and spinal cord, they supply the muscles of limb and face area. Okay. So we have upper limb muscles, flexors and extensors. Okay. We have adductors, abductors, we have external, internal rotators. Okay. So these muscles, they are exclusively innervated by the alpha motor neuron present in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Of these alpha motor neuron, they supply extrafusal fibers. So simply when muscle contracts, it is because of the result of activity of the extrafusal fibers, or simply these are the contractile fibers where we have delicate organization of sarcomere. Okay. Similarly, the gamma motor neurons, we say that they supply intrafusal fibers. So intrafusal fibers are basically the muscle spindle, or it is basically the sense organ. It does not contribute at all in the muscle contraction. Even if you stimulate gamma motor neuron and cut down alpha motor neuron, the muscle will not contract. Okay. So they serve the function of maintaining stretch reflex, and consequently they are responsible for maintaining muscle tone. You might have seen bodybuilders, how their muscles appear. Their muscles, their body appear to be torn up. Okay. It is because of the result of muscle training. Because of that, the muscle undergoes hypertrophy. Okay. And similarly, because of training, the tone in the muscle is also increased. It is because of the activity of gamma motor neuron. Okay. Now, how this happens, that is the part of motor system. Next thing, you can see, you can make out from this figure, this is transverse section of the spinal cord, showing the white matter and the gray matter in the form of H shape or butterfly shape. The anterior horn has the motor neurons supplying the muscles. So you can, from this figure, you can make out what is lying over here. This is motor end plate, and this black colored neuron is the alpha motor neuron. It is responsible for muscle contraction. The red color neuron is the gamma motor neuron. It is supplying the intrafusal muscle fiber or muscle spindle. So it makes the muscle spindle sensitive, okay, by allowing the muscle spindle's terminal ends to contract. Okay, the muscle spindle is not at all contractile, but it is contractile in its terminal end. Got it? While the extrafusal fibers, they can shorten to a considerable extent, but the intrafusal fibers or muscle spindle will contract at their terminal ends. Why do they contract? To maintain the sensitivity of the central portion. Okay, because in the central portion there lies the innervation, sensory innervation to the muscle spindle. We'll learn about this in details in the stretch reflex. So this green color fiber is the 1A fiber, 1A afferent. Okay, it is the fastest conducting sensory fiber. Okay, it is of A alpha type. Okay, according to Erlanger's gases classification, we have ABC. Type A is further divided into A alpha, A beta, A gamma, A delta. So A gamma is nothing but our gamma motor neuron, A alpha is nothing but our alpha motor neuron, and type 1A fiber and 1B fiber belongs to respectively A alpha and A beta type of are Langer's nerve fiber. You got it? So these are basically sensory fibers. The green colored sensory fiber arising from muscle spindle, the blue colored sensory fiber arising from another sensory organ, that is Golgi tendon organ. Okay, GTO reflex or Golgi tendon organ. It is again a sensory receptor which detect something different. So muscle is unique in that it can detect the change in length, that is stretch acting on the muscle, and it can also detect the muscle tension. Okay. The function of muscle is to contract, and when it contracts, it will generate tremendous amount of force, and because of that force, the muscle fibers are put under tension, and this tension may be damaging to the muscle itself. Okay, so to prevent any injury or damage to the muscle itself by its own contractile force, we have this Golgi tendon organ. Okay, so these are basically called as proprioceptors. Muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, and they appraise the brain, whether your upper limb, whether your elbow is flexed or it is extended, forearm is flexed or extended. बेटा नींद आ रही है क्या? जाओ खड़े हो जाओ. Yes, you. Are you sleeping? Go and sit over there. You go and sit over there. Okay, this is universal thing. Go and sit in front. So this is basically afferents entering in the spinal cord, forming synapse with the alpha motor neuron. You can make out that muscle spindle fiber is forming synapse with the alpha motor neuron. There is only single synapse. Okay, so it mediates monosynaptic reflex action, that is monosynaptic reflex, that is stretch reflex. Another name for stretch reflex is myotatic reflex. Myotatic reflex. You can see that Golgi tendon organ is again synapsing with the alpha motor neuron, but through an agency of interneuron, which is inhibitory interneuron, and if this Golgi tendon organ is stimulated, it will rather relax the same muscle. Okay. So reflex action is governed at the level of spinal cord through the afferent and efferent nerve fibers. Afferent from the muscles, from the muscle tendons, and efferent through the alpha motor neuron. Okay. So we have two limbs, afferent limb and efferent limb. Are you getting? For any reflex action, for any reflex arc, there are n number of components. So just remember, gamma motor neurons are innervating the muscle spindle, which is the sensory organ. So it will not at all contribute in muscle contraction. So these are the different inputs which the alpha motor neurons receive. It is not simply the input from the muscle spindle from the same muscle. It is not simply the input from the Golgi tendon organ from the same muscle. But apart from that, there are many afferent inputs coming to the alpha motor neuron. Okay, either from the same segment of the spinal cord or from the higher centers. Okay, higher centers से जो command आएगी वो directly alpha motor neuron पे जाएगी. For example, the command is to write a paragraph. Okay, within 60 seconds. Okay, so with your fingers, with your thumbs, index fingers, and with your right hand or say left hand, you are able to precisely write a paragraph with a good legitimate handwriting. Okay, this is an example of fine motor control, or playing a piano or playing a guitar. Okay, where fine skilled movements are involved. There is now no role of the sensory afferents. Rather, the command is coming from motor cortex. कहाँ से आ रही है command? Motor cortex से. So this motor cortex fiber, which are known as corticospinal fiber or pyramidal fiber, they make one-to-one connection directly with the alpha motor neurons. Okay, the plan is made in the brain, executed through the motor cortex by the lower motor neuron through the muscles, skeletal muscles. Got it? Yes. So when we go above the spinal cord, we must know, or at the level of spinal cord itself, we must know what are the motor fibers coming from higher areas that control the motor function. Number one fiber is the is the black bold color corticospinal tract. Now how to remember कहाँ से आ रहा है, कहाँ से आ रहा होगा ये corticospinal tract, कौन से cortex से? Exclusively from motor cortex, area number 4, 6, 8, primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, supplementary motor cortex, and along with that somatosensory cortex. ठीक है, ये एक्सक्लूसिवली मोटर कॉर्टेक्स से आने वाला ट्रैक्ट नहीं है. It has contribution from somatosensory cortex to an extent of 40%, premotor cortex 30%, supplementary motor cortex 30%, premotor and supplementary motor cortex contributing 30% of its fiber. कितने फाइबर रहते हैं इसमें? सबसे बड़ा और सबसे अहम ट्रैक्ट है. It has about 1 million fibers. ओके, 10 लाख फाइबर रहते हैं इस ट्रैक्ट में, है ना. तो 10 लाख फाइबर्स इन्वॉल्व है आपके फाइन मोटर कंट्रोल में. अगर इन फाइबर्स में डैमेज हो जाएगा, व्हाट विल हैपन? विल यू बी एबल टू राइट? विल यू एबल टू कॉम्ब योर हेयर्स? विल यू बी एबल टू बटन एंड अनबटन योर शर्ट्स? नो, बिकॉज these movements require the involvement of fine muscles. These are highly skilled movements. So if you come across a patient with stroke or cerebrovascular episode or hemiplegia, you can simply ask the patient whether he is able to comb his hair, whether he is able to button or unbutton his shirts, whether he is able to write. So in these movements there is involved, these are highly skilled movement, and there is involvement of this corticospinal tract as far as execution of the fine skilled movements are concerned, है ना. तो ये जो corticospinal tract है, it is divisible, it is classified into two types: lateral corticospinal tract present in the lateral white column, and anterior corticospinal tract present in the anterior white column of the spinal cord. 80 to 90% fibers are present in the lateral corticospinal tract. 10 to 15% fibers, they are present in the anterior corticospinal tract. And the control hold by the motor cortex is always contralateral, है ना. मतलब मेरा लेफ्ट कॉर्टेक्स जो है राइट साइड ऑफ बॉडी को कंट्रोल कर रहा है, और लेफ्ट राइट कॉर्टेक्स जो है वो लेफ्ट साइड को कर रहा है. क्यों ऐसा? क्यों? Fibers are crossing this while descending downwards. These fibers are crossing at the level of medulla, है ना. जैसे कि सेंसरी सिस्टम में हुआ है. Yes, like that of sensory system, the fibers they ascend till medulla and cross over to the opposite side. Similar thing happens when the fibers of the motor system do cross at the level of medulla oblongata. Okay, so at the level of medulla oblongata, on the anterior surface of this brain structure, they form an elevation called as pyramid. That's why another name for corticospinal tract is pyramidal tract. Okay, we'll learn about this in details. Just remember, apart from corticospinal tract, we have vestibulospinal, reticulospinal. Vestibulospinal means it is originating from vestibular nuclei going to spinal cord. Reticulospinal arising from reticular nuclei or reticular activating system going to spinal cord. Rubrospinal, जब कॉर्टिकोस्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट नहीं था तो सारा मोटर कंट्रोल ये करता था, रेड न्यूक्लियस. रूब्रोस्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट, इट इज अ ओल्ड मोटर कंट्रोल सिस्टम. It is there in humans, but it is not that much dominant as compared to corticospinal tract. Got it? And finally, olivospinal and tectospinal tract. Olivospinal and tectospinal tract, they regulate the muscle tone, they maintain the posture. The tectospinal tract arises from the tectal nucleus in the midbrain and controls our eye movements. Okay, so eye movement control is a part of motor system. So when we see the alpha motor neurons, we will find that the diameter is 14 micrometer and they are one of the fastest conducting type of neurons. So when we see the overall function of spinal cord, we can make out that spinal cord has alpha motor neurons or lower motor neurons, which are the common final pathway. They organize various reflex actions and constitute an important center for reflex action, as well as they have afferent and efferent limb of the reflex arc lying within them. Okay. See, when the whenever a foreign body enters in the trachea, there is sensation of coughing. If something enters inside the eye, there is sensation to rub the eye. Okay. Similarly, these are nothing, these are not skilled movements, hai na? These are reflexive action. They will happen in the same fashion. They are invariable. They are stereotype. They will have same actions whenever there is encounter with a particular type of stimulus. Finally, what does the spinal cord have? CPG. What does that mean? CPG, central pattern generator. Okay. So, we do not actually have to rely on the motor cortex for certain movements. Which movements? Walking, running, trotting, okay, galloping. These movements in lower animals as well as in humans, they are controlled by the spinal cord themselves through the central pattern generator. Only the brain is required to activate that pattern, pattern for running, pattern for walking, but the movements are exclusively located within the spinal cord itself. So, lower motor neurons, exclusively the alpha motor neurons, they are called as, yes, they are called as lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons में क्या आएगा? जितने भी न्यूरॉन ब्रेन स्टेम या स्पाइनल कॉर्ड में है और मसल को इनर्वेट कर रहे हैं, all will be inclusive under the lower motor neurons. What we have in the upper motor neurons? Yes, all the tracts coming from higher centers, including pyramidal and extrapyramidal. Yes.
Corticospinal tract के neurons
Upper motor. Corticospinal, tectospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, rubrospinal, olivospinal, सारे के सारे अपर मोटर में आएंगे, है ना. उसमें से सिर्फ कॉर्टिकोस्पाइनल को हमने कहा है पिरामिडल. कॉर्टिकोस्पाइनल अगर पिरामिडल है तो बचे हुए बाकी ट्रैक जो है वो एक्स्ट्रा पिरामिडल है. ठीक है. सो व्हाट वी हैव लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन्स इन द ब्रेन स्टेम एंड स्पाइनल कॉर्ड, and upper motor neurons coming from higher brain areas, that is motor cortex, olivary nucleus, vestibular nucleus, red nucleus, reticular nucleus. They are finally coming and converging on the lower motor neuron. किसको activate करते हैं ultimately? upper motor neurons, lower motor neurons. So, lower motor neurons, yes, they are final common pathway. So, they discretely control the axial, proximal and distal extremity muscles. अपनी बॉडी की जितनी एक्सियल मिडलाइन मसल्स है, जितनी प्रॉक्सिमल मसल्स है, जितनी डिस्टल मसल्स है, इनको सबको कौन कंट्रोल कर रहा है? लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन. लेकिन लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन भी किससे बंधा हुआ है? अपर मोटर न्यूरॉन से. जब तक अपर मोटर न्यूरॉन नहीं कहेगा, लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन मसल्स को एक्टिवेट नहीं करेगा. ठीक है. सो लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन्स का सेंसरी न्यूरॉन से साइनेप्स होता है.
तो वॉकिंग मूवमेंट की अपर मोटर न्यूरॉन्स की जरूरत नहीं होती?
एक्चुअली नहीं होती है. मैंने कहा ना, सेंट्रल पैटर्न जनरेटर इज लोकेटेड इन द स्पाइनल कॉर्ड. लेकिन आपको अभी चलना है, आपको अभी दौड़ना है, ये कहाँ से डिसाइड होगा? इसको इनिशिएट कौन करेगा? एक्टिवेट कौन कर देगा? इट इज ट्रू, यस, सेंट्रल एक्टिवेशन इज रिक्वायर्ड फॉर इनिशियल मूवमेंट. Once it is initiated, it will be taken care of by the spinal cord exclusively. That's why whenever there is fire, okay, if there is accidental fire in the ward, you can see actually the patients of hemiplegia can run. इसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि वो नाटक कर रहा है. रन करता है मतलब बिल्कुल एथलीट की तरह नहीं बनता है वो, है ना. He will not run like that of the fastest blade runner, okay, but he will make attempt to save his life. Even if there is upper motor neuron lesion, the patient can run in case of emergency. Because the CPG is present in the spinal cord. Unless and until there is spinal cord injury, the patient of hemiplegia or upper motor neuron can make an attempt to run in case of emergency. Got it? So, what happen if you cut down the lower motor neuron?
No movement. No movement.
Yes, there will be paralysis of movement. Okay. What if you cut down the upper motor neuron? पैरालिसिस दोनों केस में होगा. लोअर मोटर एलिमेंट में कौन सा पैरालिसिस होगा? फ्लैसिड. ओके, देयर विल बी लॉस ऑफ मसल टोन एंड द पैरालिसिस विल बी फ्लैसिड पैरालिसिस. यहाँ पे कैसा हो रहा है पैरालिसिस? स्पास्टिक पैरालिसिस. मसल विल एग्जिबिट हाई डिग्री ऑफ मसल टोन, देयर विल बी हाइपरटोनिया, बट द एबिलिटी टू डू फाइन मूवमेंट्स, फाइन कंट्रोल्ड मूवमेंट्स विल बी लॉस्ट इन आइदर केस. यहाँ पे तो बिल्कुल ही he is not able to move at all. Here he is able to move, sorry, he is also not able to move, but how it is differentiated? Here the paralysis is flaccid, here the paralysis is spastic.
So what's the reason?
That will learn. Hardly it is third class now. Okay, this is third lecture, so we'll learn everything, don't worry. So you cut down the nerve supply of muscle, there is no stimulus to the muscle to contract. Gradually what will happen to the muscle?
Valerian degeneration.
Yes, this is not Valerian degeneration, will be in the nerve fiber. When we talk about the muscle, there will be atrophy. So how will you define atrophy? क्या होता है atrophy? Decrease in the number and size of muscle fiber is atrophy. Decrease in the number and size of muscle fiber is atrophy. Increase in the size and number of muscle fibers will be hypertrophy. Hypertrophy of the heart, left ventricular hypertrophy, कहाँ होती है?
Hypertension.
Hypertension क्यों होती है?
Increased load on the heart.
Increase
After load.
after load on the heart. Okay, so same thing applies for the muscle. If you train your muscles, they will undergo hypertrophy, increase in the number and size. Here there will not be hypertrophy. Okay, there will be disuse atrophy and wasting. Okay, here there will be decrease in the size and numbers. Here, because of all the lower motor neurons are intact, but the commands coming from higher areas, they are not being delivered to the lower motor neuron and consequently to the muscle. The muscle will undergo disuse atrophy and wasting. Okay, disuse atrophy and wasting, more or less both the things are synonymous, they are not entire different. But when we say it is upper motor neuron lesion, we can say there is disuse atrophy and wasting. When we say lower motor neuron lesion, we say that there will be total atrophy of the muscles. Yes, next feature of LMN, क्या लिखा है? Loss of muscle tone, atonia and hypotonia. We are cutting down the reflex arc, the arc which is responsible for maintaining the muscle tone. We have cut down the efferent limb. The muscle will undergo hypotonia or atonia, complete loss of muscle tone or complete loss of or decrease in muscle tone. क्या होगा यहाँ पे? Atonia और hypotonia. यहाँ क्या होगा? सारा उल्टा खेल है ना? अपर मोटर न्यूरॉन लीजन में हाइपरटोनिया होगा, मतलब जो रिफ्लेक्स आर्क है उसका बॉस ऊपर बैठा है और उसने अपना कमांड देना बंद कर दिया, तो नीचे वालों ने क्या किया? नीचे वाले अपने ऑटो मोड पे आ गए, अपने हिसाब से सब काम कर. तो स्ट्रेच रिफ्लेक्स जो है वो एग्जागरेटेड हो जाता है, तब मसल टोन जो है बढ़ जाता है ना. इफ़ यू ट्राई टू असेस मसल टोन इन अ नॉर्मल सब्जेक्ट, नॉर्मल पर्सन, नॉर्मल हेल्दी पर्सन, यू विल फील सम रेजिस्टेंस to a passive movement. Okay, now I am flexing, so I will feel certain resistance in this muscle, antagonistic muscle or extensor of the limb. If I am try to extend the elbow, I will feel resistance offered by the flexor of the upper arm. So you can compare, tone is compared by doing movements in both the upper limbs on the similar muscles. So this resistance is highly subjective. You need to repeatedly examine to look for a normal muscle tone. When you look muscle tone in a person who is having upper motor neuron lesion, you will feel that the degree of resistance has increased because the higher influence on the stretch reflex has been removed. Okay, so the muscle will offer greater resistance to a passive stretch, leading to hypertonia. Okay, you cut down the efferent limb, the tone is abolished, it is 0, leading to atonia or hypotonia. Are you getting my point? ठीक है, अल्फा मोटर न्यूरॉन को काट दोगे तो ये सिक्वेली होगी, कॉर्टिकोस्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट्स को या पिरामिडल ट्रैक्ट या एक्स्ट्रा पिरामिडल ट्रैक्ट्स को काट दोगे तो दिस विल बी द सिक्वेली. I am cutting down the efferent limb of the reflex action, reflex arc, leading to loss of reflexes. Superficial and deep reflexes will be lost, abolished, vanished. This is called as areflexy, absence of reflex. Whenever a is suffixed, it simply means absence. Higher influences are removed. Hyperexcitability is there, leading to hyperreflexia. तो हायर सेंटर्स का इन्फ्लुएंस हमेशा फैसिलिटेटरी नहीं रहता है, थोड़ा इनिबिशन भी वो करते हैं. कुछ रिफ्लेक्स, कुछ ट्रैक्स जो होते हैं दे आर इनिबिटरी, कुछ ट्रैक्स जो होते हैं दे आर फैसिलिटेटरी और एक्साइटेटरी. सो इट डिपेंड्स अपॉन द लेवल ऑफ लीजन. गॉट इट? व्हाट इज दिस? You cut down the nerve supply of muscle, such muscle is hypersensitive to circulating neurotransmitters, leading to denervation, hypersensitivity. Because of that they may show fasciculation and fibrillations also. यहाँ पे कोई denervation hypersensitivity नहीं है, क्योंकि आपका लोअर मोटर न्यूरॉन जो है वो इंटैक्ट है, वो कहीं से कटा हुआ नहीं है. Got it? So these are the typical short note questions asked in the exam. Differentiate between upper motor and lower motor neuron lesion. 6 पॉइंट है, 6-7 पॉइंट है. Yes. In the end, complete loss of muscle power. You have cut down the lower motor neuron, common final pathway. Muscle paralysis will be evident. There is no scope of recovery. यहाँ पे कैसा है, मैंने कहा था कि हेमीप्लेजिया वाला पेशेंट कैन रन in the event if there is fire. Since the lower motor neuron is intact, only upper motor neuron is damaged, so there is variable loss of muscle power, variable loss of muscle power. Did you get the differences? Understood the differences? This is just for introduction. When we learn about these things in further classes, we'll come to know what is the physiology behind it. ऐसा क्यों हो रहा है? Why it is so? So the gamma motor neurons, yes. Higher the level of injury. Yes, yes. For spinal cord, what we have one syndrome, Brown-Sequard syndrome. Has it been covered? Sensory system. So it is a syndrome resulting from gunshot injury, bullet injury causing lesion in the half of the spinal cord. Hemisection of spinal cord. That is also known as Brown-Sequard syndrome, and this Brown-Sequard syndrome form a good prototype example of injury to spinal cord. If you cut down spinal cord entirely, full transverse section, the lower spinal cord will behave in an automatic fashion, okay. But if there is hemisection, there is typical involvement, typical motor paralysis below the level of lesion. LMN paralysis below the level of lesion and UMN paralysis at the level of lesion. Okay. So the lesions, so the effects are different. Effects are mainly grouped under three heads: below the level of lesion, at the level of lesion, and above the level of lesion. Okay. That will be taught to you in due course of time. We will not discuss that thing here because that is part of sensory system. So sir will be taking that portion. Now coming to gamma motor neurons. Gamma neurons or motor neurons are the motor only to the intrafusal muscle fiber or muscle spindle. So they maintain the muscle stretch reflex. Why you want a sustained stretch reflex? मतलब बाइसेप को स्ट्रेच करोगे तो रिफ्लेक्सली बाइसेप्स कॉन्ट्रैक्ट करेगा, है ना. इफ आई एम होल्डिंग सम वेट, द बाइसेप्स विल बी स्ट्रेच, and in response to this stretch the bicep will partially contract. This is simply the stretch reflex. Okay. This is an example. There is continuous operation of stretch reflex, inverse stretch reflex, and other reflexes involving skeletal muscle. Throughout your level of awareness, your level of consciousness, these reflexes are continually working, acting. We will learn about it in details. So, we will again cover the gamma motor neuron and alpha motor neuron over there. So, do not worry. So, just remember they maintain the muscle stretch reflex, that is all. So, their diameter is 35 micron for the cell body, and for axon it is 5 micron in diameter, which gamma motor neuron, A alpha, A beta, A gamma, A delta, according to Erlanger's Gasser classification. This fibers, they are having diameters of 5 micron for their axons, and cell body diameter is about 35 microns. Whom do they innervate? They innervate the muscle spindle, which have no role in muscle contraction. They are simply the sensory receptors present inside the muscles. Got it? So, when the gamma motor neurons are activated, the muscle spindle, that are terminal end of the muscle spindle, they contract. They contract and they maintain the responsiveness of muscle spindle to the stretch, है ना. स्ट्रेच को सेंसिटिव बनाए रखना, मसल स्ट्रेच को सेंसिटिव बनाए रखने का काम कौन कर रहा है? मसल स्पिंडल. और मसल स्पिंडल को एक्टिव रखने का काम कौन कर रहा है? गैमा मोटर न्यूरॉन. ठीक है. Why we need a stretch reflex? Because it forms the basis of muscle tone and posture. Okay. The degree of resistance offered to muscle stretching, that is muscle tone, is governed by the stretch reflex, and your upright bipedal posture, standing posture, lying posture, sitting posture is governed by the gamma motor neuron and the muscle spindle. So, the conduction velocity is less, that is 30 meter per second, owing to the smaller size. Further, apart from alpha and gamma motor neuron, we have some neurons present in the anterior gray horn. These are the interneurons. Okay. Like the GTO reflex, Golgi tendon organ reflex, the Golgi tendon organ from the same muscle is innervating the alpha motor neuron of the same muscle through an inhibitory interneuron, presumably. Yes, presumably the GTO reflex is operating in reverse direction or in opposite direction or in inverse direction of the stretch reflex. That is why it is also called as inverse stretch reflex. So, when muscle is stretched, stretch reflex will cause muscle contraction. When the muscle is stretched excessively, it will not lead to muscle contraction, rather it will lead to muscle relaxation. This is nothing but the inverse stretch reflex or Golgi tendon organ reflex. Stretch reflex is necessarily monosynaptic, GTO or inverse stretch reflex is bisynaptic, exactly, it is bisynaptic. So, the interneurons, they are site of integration, and there are about 30 times the number of interneurons as compared to the alpha and gamma motor neuron. सबसे ज़्यादा तो इंटरन्यूरॉन का ही खेल है. ब्रेन में भी बहुत ज़्यादा इंटरन्यूरॉन्स होते हैं. क्यों? उससे क्या होता है, जो ट्री बनता है, न्यूरोनल नेटवर्क बनता है, वो बहुत बड़ा और वास्ट बनता है. दैट अलाउज द प्रोसेसिंग ऑफ वेरियस इनपुट्स कमिंग टू द ब्रेन. ओके. अल्टीमेटली जो कुछ हम सीखते हैं, लर्न करते हैं या समझते हैं, इट डिपेंड्स ऑन द डेवलपमेंट ऑफ सिनेप्टिक कनेक्शन. द ग्रेटर द सिनेप्टिक कनेक्शन, द ग्रेटर विल बी the learning, the greater will be the learning, greater will be the memory quotient. Okay. The ability to recall again depends on the activation of the synapse which has formed while learning. Got it? So, the interneurons, they are site for integration because they are delivering the input coming from afferent fibers to the to the alpha motor neurons. So, the interneurons, they can be convergent, divergent and repetitive firing. ठीक है, दो neurons है, दो interneurons है, they may converge on a single alpha motor neuron, that is convergence. I mean they are either inhibiting with the same intensity with a to a single alpha motor neuron. So, they are converging. The interneuron can be diverging, they may supply, they may innervate n number of alpha motor neuron. That means their input is diverging to different neurons, that is divergence. Synapse हुआ है, synapse की property बताओ, सबसे पहली property वन वे कंडक्शन. क्यों होता है वन वे कंडक्शन?
एक साइड ही न्यूरोट्रांसमीटर,
especially in chemical synapse, but electrical synapse is bidirectional. Second property, delay. क्यों चाहिए delay? नहीं, वो तो रीजन हो गया, डिले होता है, ठीक है. न्यूरोट्रांसमीटर को रिलीज होने में समय लगेगा तो एक्शन करने में समय लगेगा. सिनेप्टिक डिले का एडवांटेज बताओ. हाँ, एक सिनेप्स 1000 इम्पल्सेस ट्रांसमिट कर सकता है एक सेकंड में, ठीक है. तीसरी प्रॉपर्टी फटीग. चौथी प्रॉपर्टी ईपीएसपी आईपीएसपी, टेम्पोरल एंड स्पेशल समेशन, वन वे कंडक्शन. सिनेप्टिक फटीग भी होता है, ठीक है. और फैसिलिटेशन और कन्वर्जेंस, डाइवर्जेंस, सबलिमिनल फ्रिंज, ऑक्लूजन, समेशन. सो दीज आर प्रॉपर्टीज ऑफ सिनेप्स, है ना. तो इंटरन्यूरॉन बीच में डालने से उतना सिनेप्स बढ़ जाएगा और उससे जो आने वाला, जो वो अफरंट इनपुट से लेने वाला जो इन्फॉर्मेशन है उसको मॉडिफाई कर सकेगा. दैट इज द इंटीग्रेशन फंक्शन. ओके, बिकॉज ऑफ द कन्वर्जेंट, डाइवर्जेंट एंड रिपीटेटिव फायरिंग टाइप्स ऑफ द इंटरन्यूरॉन्स, the actual input can be modified. Either it is suppressed, inhibited, either it is accentuated, or either it may be modified or modulated. Okay. So, the interneuron can fire to an extent of 1500 per second. Okay. Finally, they are site of processing of nerve signal. Afferent information को कितना अफेक्ट करने देना है अल्फा मोटर न्यूरॉन को, ये डिसाइड कौन करता है? इंटरन्यूरॉन्स डिसाइड करता है, ठीक है. सो फाइनली वन टाइप ऑफ इंटरन्यूरॉन इज देयर दैट इज कॉल्ड एज रेंशॉ सेल. इट इज एन इनिबिटरी मोटर इंटरन्यूरॉन. द अल्फा मोटर न्यूरॉन on one end is supplying the motor unit in the particular muscle. At the same time, it is giving out one branch or collateral, that is also called as collateral. This collateral is supplying, is activating the Renshaw cell. Renshaw cell is inhibitory interneuron, mind well. So, this Renshaw cell is in turn suppressing the activity of the same alpha motor neuron, है ना. अल्फा मोटर न्यूरॉन की एक्टिविटी एक्सेसिव ना हो तो उसको कम करने का काम, तरीका खुद अल्फा मोटर न्यूरॉन के पास ही है, through Renshaw cell. That is called as Renshaw cell inhibition. Certain toxins may affect the activity of Renshaw cell. Yes, leading to unregulated contractions, which are also called as convulsions or sustained contractions of the alpha motor neuron, especially strychnine. Do you know strychnine? It is a plant alkaloid. It acts as a poison. You will come to know about this in the forensic medicine subject in the next year. But how it works? It works by inhibitory neurotransmitter glycine release, but it acts through the Renshaw cell. Okay. So, why we have Renshaw cell? From physiological point of view, it focuses, sharpens the motor signal and thus promotes lateral inhibition. It will increase the activity of that particular alpha motor neuron. After some time it will suppress, no doubt, but it will inhibit the activity of surrounding alpha motor neuron, that is called as lateral inhibition. Lateral inhibition is very important phenomenon observed in the sensory system. ठीक है. Surround sound आपने सुना होगा. Have you heard about surround sound? Dolby digital sound, 4K, 6K, 8K, क्या होता है ये? पिक्चर रिजोल्यूशन होता है ना, 4K. सराउंड साउंड क्या होता है? सराउंड इनिबिशन क्या होता है? पढ़ो. गो through the books and read. ऐसे ही पढ़ो, गूगल पे ही देख लो, ठीक है. So it increase the lateral inhibition, it maintains the lateral inhibition so that the surrounding alpha motor neurons are not activated, rather they are inhibited by the collaterals given from the Renshaw cell. And finally, some terminologies pertaining to motor system. What is agonist? Particular muscle initiating particular movements, or for example flexor. When flexor we have biceps, the antagonist is triceps. When biceps is contracting, when agonist is contracting, antagonist should, how this is achieved? What is reciprocal innervation? Yes. So when this muscle is contracting, the antagonist muscle should relax. This is possible when there is arrangement called as reciprocal innervation, है ना. तो रेसिप्रोकल इनर्वेशन ऑलमोस्ट ऑल मसल्स में है ना. जब हम ट्राइसेप्स को एक्सटेंड करेंगे तो बाइसेप्स रिलैक्स करेगा. दिस इज पॉसिबल बिकॉज ऑफ रेसिप्रोकल इनर्वेशन. ओके, दिस रेसिप्रोकल इनर्वेशन सर्किट इज प्रेजेंट इन यूर स्केलेटल मसल. बुक में दिया है इसका डायग्राम. इसका सर्किट ड्रॉ करना है आपको, ठीक है. योर असाइनमेंट, आई एम गिविंग यू असाइनमेंट. Write down the differences between lower motor neuron lesion and upper motor neuron lesion. Each of you have to show this to me in this week only. Okay, differences between LMN and UMN. Then circuit diagram for reciprocal innervation and inhibition, and then transverse section of spinal cord showing afferent and efferent inputs coming from a muscle. ठीक है, ठीक है. आधे घंटे में हो जाएगा. अब कौन दिखाता है इसको, इस पे निर्भर करता है. सो अगोनिस्ट आर द ग्रुप ऑफ मसल्स इन्वॉल्व इन पर्टिकुलर और स्पेसिफिक मूवमेंट. सिनर्जिस्टिक group of muscles are the muscles which help the agonist in establishing these movements. Antagonists are the muscles which oppose that movement. And finally, fixator, the muscles that stabilize the joint during certain movement. For example, I am writing, okay. So no shoulder muscles are involved, rather the muscles of the fingers are involved in writing. So these are the fixator muscles. Got it? So we will briefly touch what is reflex action and reflex arc. So what is reflex action? Anybody? Automatic, involuntary, stereotype response to a stimulus is reflex action. Okay. So the motor system holds the control over two types of movements, voluntary skilled movement and second involuntary reflex movement. रिफ्लेक्स मूवमेंट को सप्रेस किया जा सकता है. यू कैन सप्रेस द रिफ्लेक्सेस. यस. सो व्हाट इज रिफ्लेक्स एक्शन? इट इज इनवॉलंटरी, ऑटोमेटिक, स्टीरियोटाइप रिस्पॉन्स टू अ स्टिमुलस. You know there are n number of reflexes. When light is shown to pupil, the pupil will constrict. This is pupillary reflex. When you are observing a near object, your accommodation changes from distant to near vision, in which there is increase in the curvature of lens, meiosis, constriction of pupil, and you are able to read out the things very clearly. So this is accommodation reflex. Entry of foreign body inside on the corneal surface, striking of foreign body on the corneal or conjunctival surface will result in reflex closure of eyelids. It is blink reflex or corneal reflex or conjunctival reflex. Entry of foreign body or dust particle inside the nostril will result in reflex sneezing. Entry of dust particle in the respiratory tract will result in coughing. Similarly, when the muscles are stretched, they will respond by showing reflex contraction. This is an example of stretch reflex, which is a monosynaptic reflex. So, reflex action is involuntary automatic stereotype response to a stimulus. इनवॉलंटरी है, ऑटोमेटिक है और अपने आप होने वाला है ना. स्किल है क्या? फॉरेन बॉडी अंदर गई फिर मैं खासूंगा, ये स्किल है ना. It is not a skill, it happens automatically, it has to happen unless and until there is damage or injury to the reflex arc. It will happen on its own. Got it? Then it is relatively predictable. What do you mean by predictable? Yes, response is similar, always similar, predictable, involuntary and stereotype to an exciting or eliciting stimulus. Got it? What is the basis of reflex action? जो सर्किट है, जो फिजिकल स्ट्रक्चर है, जो रिफ्लेक्स एक्शन करवा रहा है, that is called as reflex arc. You know, you are aware of this reflex arc and reflex action. Just simply we are studying them in details. So, the components of reflex arc, the first component, sensor or receptor or the sense organ, it is must. Second, sensory neuron or afferent neuron, it should enter into the CNS, either into the spinal cord or brainstem. Third, integrating center, mostly present in the spinal cord, where lies synapse. जब तक synapse नहीं बनेगा तब तक कोई reflex arc, कोई reflex action हो नहीं सकती. Efferent neuron, that is motor neuron. Okay, and finally effector. Effector may be a muscle or gland. Sometimes there is lacrimation, okay, stimulation of tear films because of entry of foreign. Again, it is a protective phenomena. Okay, but at this time the gland is lacrimatory gland, which increases the reflex lacrimation. So, these are the 5 components of reflex arc. Yes.
सर ये जो रिफ्लेक्स आर्क है वो अभी हमने देखी थी ना स्पाइनल कॉर्ड में 1A फाइबर्स,
वो भी है, सेम चीज़ है एग्जैक्टली.
अल्फा और मोटर न्यूरॉन
1A 1B टाइप 2 afferent फाइबर्स. वहाँ पे रिसेप्टर सेंस ऑर्गन क्या है? मसल स्पिंडल और गोल्जी टेंडन ऑर्गन. afferent फाइबर्स क्या है? 1A टाइप 2 फॉर muscle spindle reflex or stretch reflex. For inverse stretch reflex, the Golgi tendon organ is the sense organ and type 1B fibers are the afferent fibers. They are entering through the dorsal root, forming synapse directly with the alpha motor neuron in case of stretch reflex, through the inhibitory interneuron in case of inverse stretch reflex. Yes, and the effector is the muscle itself. So, stretch reflex और inverse stretch reflex में रिसेप्टर भी मसल के अंदर है और इफेक्टर भी खुद अपना मसल ही है. कोरिलेट करो, यस, मैक्सिमम थिंग्स नीड टू बी कोरिलेटेड. सो दिस इज द डायग्राम showing the electrical events and the physical parts or components of reflex arc. What are the components of reflex arc? Sense organ, afferent neuron, ये इसकी सेल बॉडी है जो डॉर्सल रूट गैंग्लियन में रहती है ना. ये जाके स्पाइनल कॉर्ड के अंदर क्या करता है? सिनेप्स करता है. एक सिंगल सिनेप्स है, मोनोसिनेप्टिक रिफ्लेक्स. ये मोटर न्यूरॉन का एक्सॉन है, किसको इनर्वेट कर रहा है? स्केलेटल मसल को. तो ये हो गया इफेक्टर, ये न्यूरोमस्कुलर जंक्शन है, ये इफरेंट न्यूरॉन है, ये सिनेप्स है, ये अफरेंट न्यूरॉन है, ये सेंस ऑर्गन है. सेंस ऑर्गन जब कभी स्टिमुलेट होता है तो डायरेक्टली इट विल नॉट जनरेट एक्शन पोटेंशियल, rather it will generate receptor potential or generator potential. If generator potential is strong enough, it will generate action potential in the sensory axons. This action potential will summate at the level of synapse to generate either EPSP or IPSP. इंटरन्यूरॉन रहेगा तो IPSP जनरेट करेगा, डायरेक्ट कनेक्शन कर रहा है तो EPSP जनरेट करेगा. अब ये मोटर न्यूरॉन क्या जनरेट करता है? एक्शन पोटेंशियल विच इज ट्रांसमिटेड टिल द न्यूरोमस्कुलर जंक्शन. At the level of neuromuscular junction, there at the end plate level there is end plate potential. If it is strong enough, it will result in action potential and muscle contraction. Got it? We'll continue in the next class about the reflex arc and reflex action and type of reflexes. ठीक है.